fall gardening and soil health. Just a quick housekeeping things. We are going to have our plant pickup. We're like 98% certain we'll have our plant pickup on next Wednesday on the 11th, 4 to 6 p.m. at hopefully at the Topper Academy. We're still confirming a few things. And then our next workshop is going to be in September. It'll be the second week of September instead of the first week, just to avoid Labor Day weekend, because no one wants to have a workshop on a holiday. And we are probably going to do this in person, but outside, so that we can do a live demo of putting together your season extension materials. And we will, that's probably also the day we're going to give out our cover crop seed. Just because the place that we buy our cover crop seed from doesn't have it in for next week. So we'll give it out in September. So I'm going to be talking a lot about cover crops in this presentation, but we won't be giving them out to you until September. And then if you have not yet, please get in your harvest totals, even if you just need to report that you don't have anything, but hopefully you are having an abundant harvest at this point. That's what we're really hoping for you, that you're getting lots of food out of your garden. So please get your harvests into Rosie. And also if you have not yet put in your fall plant order, then get that to her also. And if you have any issues with how to get in either of those, then please
will you put these in that
email Rosie and she'll answer your questions. All right, so fall gardening, why I love it. So fall gardening is my favorite time to garden. And I just want to say a lot of folks think that the gardening season begins in April, May and ends in October, but it's totally possible to grow 12 months out of the year in East Tennessee. And you really only need some very minimal protection for most years. And it's totally awesome because it's not hot. There are fewer pests and diseases. You're not going to be eaten by mosquitoes standing out in your garden. In the winter, weeds don't grow as much, and it's just awesome. So what else do you need to hear about fall gardening? Well, there's a few things you need to hear because I've got a whole presentation on it. But when you're thinking about fall gardening, there's 3 basic concerns that you need to keep in mind as you're planning out your fall garden and as you're going into it. That's the timing of the first frost, which is usually around the end of October in East Tennessee, in, I should say, Washington County. If you're up, higher elevation, your first frost may come a little sooner. And then there's overall general cooler temperatures, which affects plant growth, and then also decreasing daylight as we get into the winter months also affects plant growth. So our first frost, generally late October, sometimes not until November. Some years it doesn't freeze until December, but I wouldn't count on that. So we have approximately 80 days between now and when our first frost is going to occur. So you still have time if you want to plant more summer crops with fast maturity dates. There's plenty of time to do that. So you can get in another round of bush beans, not pole beans. Pole beans usually take a lot longer, but bush beans, cucumbers, summer squash like zucchini, edamame. There may be a few other things that I'm not remembering off the top of my head, but those things can go into the ground now. For instance, I've got a little seed packet here, and the zucchini says 50 days to harvest. So there's plenty of time for you to get another round of zucchini in, so long as the days to harvest are pretty short. So just check your seed packets and figure out if you want to plant some more summer stuff. That's totally possible. So with the cooler temps, that means we can start getting into plants that prefer cooler temperatures like leafy greens, more brassicas, peas, alliums. That means things in the onion family, and then some root vegetables like carrots, parsnips, rutabaga, turnips, that kind of stuff. However, these are cool loving crops, and so you need to plant them now in order for them to mature in time for the fall. So that means that, but they don't like the heat. So you have to really keep them well watered to make sure that they grow and make it through to the cooler temperatures. And then you want to look on seed packets, or if you're buying more seeds, you want to look for something that says it's for fall or winter growing or early spring. That means it's going to prefer cooler temps. And then a cool thing about a lot of these crops is that they will survive the frost when it comes, and they often get a lot sweeter after it freezes, because sugar is actually what plants produce as a natural antifreeze. So a lot of plants will get it's not just your imagination, they actually do taste sweeter after the frost. And then some plants are more frost hardy than others when you're thinking about different varieties to grow. So for instance, like collards will probably survive down below like 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Other things like cauliflower, which is a little tricky to grow because it really hates hot weather, but it also doesn't really survive hard freezes either. So you know, some years you plant it and it just is miserable in the heat, and then we get an early first frost and it just dies. So that's kind of a crapshoot, but you know, if you really like cauliflower, it's worth trying just in case the weather does cooperate. And then I have posted this PowerPoint into the folder for the Build It Up binder. So you can actually get this link. It's the blog. She hasn't posted in years, but the website is still up. It's called Mother of a Hubbard. And she has a lot of really amazing resources on winter growing. I think she was growing in Kentucky, so she's basically in the same zone that we are here in Northeast Tennessee. So she has a lot of really awesome resources on winter growing, including this list that I've posted a link to. So you can, we'll send out this PowerPoint, or you can view it on the Google Drive. 10 vegetables more cold hardy than kale. So this will kind of give you a list of things that you can grow in the winter. So the last consideration beyond the frost and the cooler temperatures is day length. So plants need more than 10 hours of daylight in order to grow. And so plenty of plants are frost hardy, so they don't care if it's freezing or not outside, that they'll stay alive, but they will stop growing when the daylight dips below 10 hours. And this happens in mid-December through mid-January. So this is a period of time when all plant growth ceases. And so you need to time your planting of plants in order for them to be mature by early December. So if you make a final planting of like lettuce and spinach, which will grow in cooler temperatures and grow in cooler soil no problem, you need to make sure they're in the ground by late September so that they're mature by early December. So late September is kind of the last planting date for the fall. After that, you're probably not going to have enough time for anything to grow and be mature for that December 10th daylight shift. And then once we hit January 15th and daylight, it starts to go beyond 10 hours a day, things will very gradually start to wake up and start growing again. And then most overwintered crops, so you have this period of time where they're growing and they're doing great from about January to March. And by March, a lot of overwintered crops will start going to flower. And at that point, they start tasting kind of weird. So they're probably not as good. So you want to eat them before they start flowering, basically in March. But that's cool. So basically, I mean, you can plant, if you plant a bunch of spinach, say in September, and you can basically eat off of that crop of spinach, you know, until March. So that's the nice thing about this. And there's, you know, again, very few pests and diseases. So it basically just hangs out in your garden, maybe under a little row cover if it gets too cold, or we get a really hard frost. You can put a little cloth over it, but the plants should be fine. And you can just basically eat off of them until March. So, oh, I went the wrong direction, sorry. Okay, so making room for fall crops. So this is another time to bust out your paper and pens and pencils and start drawing a new plan for your garden, just to kind of make sure you have enough room for stuff. So this is a super rough sketch that I made as an example for this slide, but yours can be a little neater if you want. So our fall crops again are coming next Wednesday. So you need to make an assessment of where you want to put stuff, because a lot of our summer crops like tomatoes, peppers, squash, that kind of stuff will grow until frost. So these plants will stay alive in your garden until, late October. However, if you wait until late October late October is too late for you to plant new things into your garden. So you need to make an assessment now. If your garden is totally full, if you right now, then you need to make an assessment of what you're going to pull out in order to make room for your fall crops to go in. So, but likely, I mean, at this point, you've probably got some holes in your garden where things have grown and you've pulled them up. So you can fill in those holes, and if you want to make more room, you have to figure out what you want to pick and pull out in order to make room for your fall stuff. So I like to just draw another plan, figure out where things are going, and basically think about, what do you want to be eating in November out of your garden, and understanding that that's not going to be tomatoes and peppers. So having a plan for this transition period. So, you can definitely, like I said in the first few slides, you can definitely put in more summer crops, like beans and summer squash, but just keep in mind that those things are going to die at frost. So you're also probably getting in, you're probably harvesting some of your storage crops. And so this includes things like potatoes, probably not, don't pick sweet potatoes just yet. Those come out in late September, early October, but you're probably getting your regular potatoes. You could be picking things like beets and carrots, cabbage, your pumpkins, your winter squash. Those are probably coming in right now, or starting to come in. And so a lot of these things will store for many months under the right conditions. However, what those conditions are kind of depends on the crop, and I don't have enough time or space in this presentation. So I put a link in to johnnyseeds.com, which is a super comprehensive guide to storage vegetables and what you need to do. So different crops, there's basically 4 different environments for storing vegetables, and that's a cold dry storage, a cold moist storage, a cool dry storage, and a cool moist storage. And so if you are crafty and you have an unfinished crawl space basement area, or a root cellar, or you go online and you find plans for how to convert part of your garage into a root cellar. So you can within one space create all 4 of these conditions. If you go online and find guides to make that happen. So a lot of things will just kind of hang out, in your basement, or under under a table in your spare room, or whatever, for a few months anyway. But if you want to get maximum shelf life out of things, then they need to be in the proper storage condition. And especially if you're trying to grow enough food for your family year round, storage crops are one great way to do it, because it's a lot of these things are fairly good sources of calories and nutrients, and they don't need to be a lot of them don't need to be stored using electricity. You can get them set up in a root cellar, which is old school kind of storage. So if that's important to you, that's something you can look into doing. Otherwise, if you're not growing these on any, if you've only grown like 5 pounds of potatoes or something, you don't need to worry about storing them under proper conditions. You're going to be able to eat those fast enough. But if it is something you're interested in, then check out these resources, and also Google how to make a root cellar in your basement. Seed saving is also another huge topic that I get a lot of questions about this time of year. And I love seed saving. It's totally something that, it's easy to get into for certain crops. Other crops are a lot harder. but there's plenty of very approachable crops you can get into. There's a lot of resources online if that's something, and there's a lot of good books on the subject if that's something you want to get into. But understand that you can only save seeds from open pollinated plants. If you try to save seeds from something that's a hybrid, then you are not going to, those seeds are not going to breed true. You're not going to get the same variety that the parent plant is that you're saving seeds from. So if you don't know about some of the seeds that we have provided, you can totally ask, and I can look up that information for you and make sure if you want to save seeds, you're saving only from open pollinated varieties. And heirloom is another word for open pollinated, but not all open pollinated varieties are heirlooms, but all heirlooms are open pollinated, I guess, is one way to put it. Heirloom just means that it's from, I think, pre 1940s or something. It's an older variety, whereas like plenty of people are breeding new open pollinated varieties these days. So and then another thing you have to consider is that some plants need to be isolated more than others. Otherwise, there's cross-pollination and you're not going to be able to breed true on the seeds. And so maybe this is a little too complicated, but sometimes you have to hand pollinate and protect the flowers and bag them so that you're not getting any cross-contamination with genetics on yours. But anyway, look this up. Two really easy ones to get started with are beans and peas. And basically these need very minimal isolation. So you just need a variety to be, at least 20 feet away from another variety. So if you're only planting one variety of bean in your garden, then you're totally good. Otherwise, they need to be, about 20 feet away from each other. And then basically to collect beans and peas, you just need to let them mature and dry on the plant until they're nice and the pods are nice and crispy. And then take them off, shell them, and then it's important to freeze them after you shell them for at least a week. You don't have to keep them permanently in the freezer, although that's perfectly acceptable. But there is a bean weevil, a little insect that will bore into the seeds. And so if you don't freeze them, the freezing kills the weevils basically. And so you may have, a few peas that are infected with the weevil. And if you freeze them, they all die. But if you don't freeze them and you just stick them in a bag somewhere, then the weevil will pop out of, the few infected beans and it'll start multiplying and will infect all of your beans and put holes in on them, and they won't be any good. So definitely freeze them so you kill the little insect in them. And the tomatoes are another, not quite as easy as beans, but still pretty easily. Most tomatoes are self-pollinating, so they really, again, only need to be isolated by 20 feet. And then in most cases, even if they're next to each other, they're not going to cross-pollinate, but there is more of a risk if they're packed together of them cross-pollinating. So if you do want to save tomato seed, it's best to have, at least a few feet of distance in between different varieties. So basically you harvest the tomatoes when they're ripe, you scoop out the pulp and the seeds into a jar, you let it ferment, which basically just means it sits out on your counter at room temperature for 2 or 3 days. It may grow mold, it's fine, just scrape it off. And then after 2 or 3 days, just put the whole mess into a fine mesh colander or I'm blanking on the word, but whatever. Just make sure that when you wash them, they don't run down the sink. A strainer, that's what I want. Strain the seeds. Yeah, put them in a strainer. Wash them clean and then spread them out like on a paper towel or a piece of paper and let them totally dry out, and then scrape them off, and you can put them in just, a seed packet. Make sure you label it what it is, and then that can store in a freezer in an airtight container, and you've saved tomato seeds. It's probably a fun experiment with kids, just watching this goo kind of ferment a little and then cleaning them. So definitely give it a try, and it's a great way to, save money on purchasing seeds by saving your own. And then things get a little more complicated, like squash and okra are really easy to save seeds on, but there's also a higher risk of genetic cross-contamination if you've got other varieties growing nearby, or even if because they're bee pollinated, and so the bees are traveling, several miles around. So they may be visiting all your neighbors' gardens and then coming to yours. And so you have to isolate the flowers. So if that's something you want to get into, there's definitely tons of resources online. Just Google seed saving and you can get into the wide world. Okay, so I've talked a whole bunch. Are there any questions while we're here? Since I've thrown so much at you.
Are these sun golds that that we got, are those a good tomato to seed save?
Those are hybrids, and apparently they're a very complicated hybrid. And so they will not breed true. I've looked into it because sometimes a hybrid, if it's a really simple hybrid, I don't want to get too far off in the weeds on this question, but if it's just a simple parentage, it's pretty easy to breed an open pollinated variety out of a hybrid. But apparently the sun golds are very complicated, and folks have not managed to breed out an open pollinated variety yet. So
I see.
Yeah.
Well, they were definite hits. So thank you to everyone who talked me into getting those, because I honestly don't know that I have a good count on those, because seriously, everyone eats them right off the plant when they're outside.
Nice. Yeah, yeah. No, those the sun golds are definitely my favorite too. I
have a question.
Oh, go ahead. Oh, sure.
Sorry, I have a question. As far as like planting, doing second plantings of like beans and carrots and all, and like lettuce, is it okay to plant them in the same place as we did earlier in the season, or do you have to rotate them even within the season?
Yeah, thanks for that question. You do not need to rotate within the same season. So yeah, you can continue to plant them in the same spot so long as the previous round did not die of some crazy disease. Okay. So barring that, yeah, I think it should be fine to plant. It's probably too complicated to think about rotating within a single year. So.
Yeah, I was getting overwhelmed by that.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, thank you.
Just be careful, like if you have brassicas overwintering, through the spring, and then you plant another round of brassicas in that spot, I would not then plant a third round in the fall in that area. So just keep in mind of things like that. You don't want to overdo it.
There's a couple other questions in the chat. How are herbs in the fall?
Yeah, so most herbs are perennials, like your rosemary and thyme and oregano, sage, those kind of things are perennials. So you can plant those anytime, and most of them will overwinter just fine. Basil is a frost sensitive annual, so it will not overwinter. And it's probably too late to plant more basil. But cilantro and dill are both annuals, but they're also a little more frost or cool temperature tolerant. So you probably could get another round of those things in. So basically not basil, but most herbs, yes, are good for fall, are fine. Are peppers difficult? No, peppers are really easy to save seeds from, but you just need to harvest the seeds from ripe plants. So don't try to save seeds from your green peppers. They have to be fully mature, like no green streaking at all. So whatever the mature color of the pepper is, it needs to be fully that color. And that's when the seeds are ripe. And yeah, you don't need to ferment them or anything like you do the tomatoes. You can just pull them out of the plants and then dry them off. I think, and they also are, like tomatoes, also self-pollinating for the most part. So as long as you just have 10 or 20 feet of isolation in between varieties, peppers should be good to go too. A lot of bell peppers are hybrids. So I think the bell pepper we handed out and the snacking peppers that we handed out are hybrids. Maybe, I don't know, but the jalapeno and I don't know. You'll have to check and make sure it's an open pollinated variety. And I'm not actually sure off the top of my head if we gave out any open pollinated pepper varieties this year. But yeah, for the most part, they're pretty easy to save. Sun golds are the tiny orange tomatoes, and they are amazing. Okay, yeah. Are we good on questions?
Yeah.
I have one more.
Yeah.
Kind of sorry, a little off topic, but since you mentioned basil, I have like several bushes and I don't want them to go to waste. So I think we talked about it once, but just to remind me, because baby brain, can I just, what's the best way I can do to save them? Because to me, that's like green gold.
Yeah, I mean, I like to make pesto and freeze it.
Yeah.
Basil is kind of hard to dry because it turns black when you dry it. It doesn't stay nice and green like a lot of herbs do. But I guess it retains its flavor for the most part. So you could try drying it if you don't mind it just turning black. But to me, the best one is just making a lot of pesto and freezing it. And if you don't like large quantities of pesto, I like to fill ice cube trays with it and freeze it in ice cube trays and then pop those out into a bag, in a freezer bag. And then I just have like little 1 ounce cubes of pesto that I can toss into things.
Okay, so definitely just make the pesto. And could I also just blend the straight up basil and then freeze it as well if I wanted to use it for something different?
Yeah, I think people also just blend it with a little oil and freeze that. Yeah, I think you can freeze herbs in oil.
Okay, I'll definitely try that. We've been making pesto and we're obsessed. Thank you.
Yeah, cool. My sweet potatoes just started vining. Yeah, you can, let them go. You can let your sweet potatoes go up until frost. You just have to really, when you get into October, you really have to start paying attention to the weather reports, because if it freezes and they're still in the ground, there's a strong chance they'll be damaged and they won't be any good. They're very frost sensitive. So you can let them go up until first frost, basically. So just keep them out. Dig them out as soon as temperatures start to get close to 32. But yeah, it's hard to say. Hopefully they'll do all right. Okay. Any other? If not, if you have another question, you can just sorry, is someone trying to just put it in the chat for the moment. Okay, onward.
I'm gonna can some stuff.
What's this for?
Me.
Someone's needs to go
One
on mute.
is not muted.
Okay. All right. So the last half, we're going to talk about soil health, also one of my favorite topics, and no-till gardening. This is something I know a lot of folks are interested in, how to set up no-till, and it can be a little tricky, especially with our clay soils, but it's something you can work on, and it's a goal you can work on, and hopefully in 2 or 3 years you can get to a point where you don't need to till anymore. And fall is really the perfect time to start thinking about this, because you can start adding a lot of compost and mulch, and you can sow cover crops this time of year. And you may be asking, why should I bother with all this? But healthy soil grows healthy plants, and no-till is one way to achieve healthier soil. And so better soil means better yields, fewer pest and disease problems over the long term, but it can be kind of intensive to turn our terrible clay soil into something that you don't actually need to till every year. So we will talk about that. The soil there's actually a lot of life going on in your soil. Some people refer to this as the underground herd. In a really healthy soil, there's up to 2 tons worth of critters basically living per acre. And so that's basically the equivalent of 2 cows living underground in terms of, the mass of all of these different creatures, living there. So you can think about, all these things that improve soil health are actually going to nurture basically your underground herd. And so it's these creatures, these bacteria and fungi and protozoa, nematodes, and worms, and all these other stuff. These are the things that are responsible for building good soil. They also form symbiotic relationships with your plants, and so they're the ones that are breaking down all the nutrients and minerals in the soil and helping the plant roots uptake these nutrients. They're helping to improve water flow, so that in time when it rains heavily, they help the water flow through without causing erosion. And when it's dry, they help actually hold on to water. They both improve drainage and also improve the water holding capacity of soil, so that roots are able to access water for longer in drier conditions. And they also help to fight pests and diseases, among many other essential services for your garden. So anytime you're making decisions about your garden, consider basically your underground herd, for whatever you're doing. And if you keep them in mind, you're going to come out the end with healthier soil and a healthier garden overall. So what does tilling do to your soil? It causes a lot of soil degradation, which can lead to erosion, which can lead to nutrient runoff. So basically, those nutrients, you're paying money every year to buy, well, not when you're in this program, but most years you're buying fertilizer, to add nutrients to your soil. And if you're not concerned about soil health, every time it rains, then if your soil is poor and unhealthy, then every time it rains, the water is basically just going to carry away your fertilizer and your nutrients. And so basically it's washing your money away. So you have a financial incentive to improve your soil health, especially when you get up onto a larger scale, like a farm. That's real serious money that's going into the river every time it rains, if you're not focused on soil health. So tilling also causes hard pan. So basically anywhere the metal, anytime you put metal into the soil and you're tilling it up like that, there's a layer, it's creating a layer of compaction underneath where the metal hits. So it doesn't matter how deep your tiller goes, whether it goes 6 inches or 8 inches or 12 inches, whatever. However deep it goes, right under that, there is a layer of compaction called a hard pan. And that is, especially in our clay soils, basically creating a layer of brick underneath there. And that the plant roots cannot break through that hard pan. Water cannot flow through that hard pan. So you're creating a lot of compaction issues in your soil. And tilling increases weeds. Anytime you till, you're bringing up seeds to the surface. And so those seeds are seeing sunlight and they're sprouting. So going no-till over the long run will actually reduce the weed seeds that are germinating in your garden. And then you're also stirring in a lot of oxygen, which can help energize bad soil pathogens in your garden. So there's a lot of negatives to tilling. Obviously, the benefit is creating soil that you can plant into each year, in the spring. But in a lot of ways, tilling creates more problems than it solves. And it creates more compaction. So then you wind up tilling more often in order to deal with the compaction, but it's just a negative spiral. So tilling causes compaction. You till because there's compaction, but then it increases the amount of compaction, and it's just a bad spiral. So this is trying to break that cycle of compaction and poor soil health. So going no-till, it has a lot of benefits, and the way that it does it, you're doing it basically by increasing soil organic matter. I'm going to talk a lot about organic matter, but that's basically another way of saying soil carbon. So you're thinking about increasing the amount of carbon basically that's being stored in your soil. And this is something that you can measure on a soil test. And ideally, you want to see soils with soil organic matter around 3 to 6%. When I do soil tests, most people are hovering around 2% if they've not been doing anything. So there's a lot of room for improvement in our East Tennessee soils. Anyway, so Can you go completely no-till? Probably not in your first year. It takes a lot of planning and a lot of putting in materials on your soil. But you can focus on going low till for at least the next few years, minimizing tillage as much as possible, trying to do it, just once and no more. Conventional no-till on a large scale relies on glyphosate, which is basically Roundup. Or Roundup is glyphosate, it's just the brand name, to kill grass and cover crops and that kind of thing. So it's a little harder to do it organically, because you don't have an herbicide that you can spray. So you rely a lot on tarps and black plastic or cardboard or something, so to smother basically the plant material that's on your surface of your soil. So if this is something you want to get into next year, then start collecting tarps. I know Harbor Freight, for instance, sometimes puts tarps on sale, so you can get them for pretty cheap if you're paying attention to their coupons. So you have to start collecting materials for it. Basically, you have to plan in advance. So we're going to talk a little bit about the soil health principles, because I don't think I've deep dived into this in previous ones so far. There are 5 soil health principles, and that is basically to keep your soil covered, disturb the soil as little as possible, keep plants growing year round, diversify plant species, and then incorporate animals and manure into your garden. So number 1, keep your soil covered. This is what I see driving around in the winter. I see a lot of bare soil, and Ray Archuleta, who's a really, he's got a lot of YouTube videos on soil health online. He describes this as your soil being naked, hungry, thirsty, and running a fever, and that this is very unhealthy soil when it's bare like this. So I think I try to talk about mulching in every single workshop. And so you can mulch using mulch materials, or you can use cover crops and then plant into the dead cover crop residue. I'll talk a little bit more about that in later slides. But keeping your soil covered reduces weeds, it retains moisture, it keeps the soil cool, and also it provides soil organic matter, which is what's feeding your underground herd. So in the fall, if you want to get ready, you can lay down, I recommend when you're planting in the spring to put down 4 to 6 inches of material. But when you're going into the fall and you want to put your garden to rest, basically, you can lay down 6 to 12 inches or more of material like straw, grass clippings, shredded leaves, yard waste, compost, whatever, in order to provide a lot of material that's just going to rot down and basically build topsoil over the winter. So you have 5 or 6 months over the winter where you can just be creating compost basically in your garden. So number 2 principle is reduce soil disturbances. This basically means reduce or eliminate tillage. And then what I recommend, at the beginning of the year is to create permanent planting and walking areas. So basically to dig out walking areas and pile that soil onto your planting areas, and then do your best not to step on any of the planting areas to reduce compaction as much as possible. All right, so number 3 is keep plants growing year round. And you're like, Lexi, what is this strange picture that you've presented on the screen? This is actually it's a picture of a blown up root. So this is what's happening on a microscopic level between a plant root and all of the soil life going on around it. So plants actually are exuding sugar into the soil. So they're photosynthesizing, in their leaves, and they're making carbohydrates, basically sugars, and that, the plant is using that in order to grow and feed itself, but it's also leaking excess sugars into the soil, and that is feeding the microbes and all the life down there. So they're eating that sugar, and in exchange, they're providing nutrients to the plants. So that feeds the microbes. The microbes are digesting nutrients in the soil and sending those back to the plant. So that's this wonderful symbiotic relationship. But basically, when there are no plant roots in the soil, then there's no food for those microbes either, because there's no sugar being provided to them. So they basically, once the plants have been pulled up, they will eat through their supply of food, And then once they're done with that and there's no new plants, then those microbes basically starve and die. And so next year you're starting, if you go all winter without any plants in the soil, you start in the spring, there's far fewer microbes remaining, and and they have to slowly rebuild, when there's plants again, when there's food again. So not breaking that cycle by growing cover crops or growing food crops year round can help keep all those little friends alive in the soil. And number 4 is growing a diversity of plants, because not all plants produce the same kind of food from their roots. So different plants will cultivate different microbes in the soil. So by having a diversity of plants, you're going to have a more diverse and resilient microbe population in your soil. And so you can achieve this principle by doing crop rotations, companion planting, and then putting in a cover crop mix of 2 to 10 species. I think ours has 4 in it, the one we hand out. So all right, and the final one is to incorporate animals and manure. I would also throw compost into this too. So if you have chickens or ducks, or even if you're a farmer and you also have cattle or pig or hogs or something, you can let them at the end of the season run through your fields and kind of clean up any excess material, and also let them basically poop in your garden. You don't want to let them do it while you're in the middle of harvesting, because you don't want them to contaminate your feed. But at the end of the season, you can let them run through and help you add some fertilizer to your garden. You can also just buy or source manure and spread it in the fall. You really want at least 90 days, if not 120 or more days between when you lay down manure and when you're actually going to put your next round of food crops in, just for food safety purposes. So the fall is a good time to do that. But just be careful with anytime you buy manure, and we've seen it. Rosie and I were actually at a place where we saw some herbicide contamination of a tomato plant. So you just make sure that you know where you're getting your manure from, because of these persistent herbicides. So if someone's spraying their fields and those animals are eating that sprayed hay, then they're getting these herbicides in their system, and they're pooping it out. It's in the manure, and it's a persistent herbicide, so it stays in the manure for at least 3 to 5 years, if not longer, and will kill your plants. So anytime you're getting a new manure in from a new source, put it in a pot and try to put a tomato in there or something, just to see if it kills the tomato. Just to make sure that you're not spreading this on your whole garden, because at that point, if you put contaminated manure on your garden, then you're not going to be able to plant in that area for the next 5 years. So that's something you want to avoid. Okay, cover crops. Cover cropping over the winter, it prevents erosion, it increases your soil organic matter, it increases soil life and diversity, because you're putting in a mix of plants, and you're feeding the underground herd all winter long. It stabilizes and increases nutrients in the soil. If you plant legumes like clover or peas in your cover crop mix, then they're also actively fixing nitrogen into your soil, which improves your nutrients for the next round of crops that come after it. It also suppresses weeds. I think I mentioned this in a previous class, that bare soil just invites weeds into your garden. So by putting in cover crops, you're not giving weeds any space to grow, and you're controlling what goes into your garden at all times, and can help suppress and reduce the amount of weed seed that's going on. So a lot of benefits to it. There's different types of things that can go in. Again, this presentation is going to be in the Build It Up Dropbox, or not Dropbox, the Google Drive. So you can, if you really want to study this information, you can. But basically, there's 4 types of things that can go into a cover crop mix. There's grasses, like winter rye, or in the spring you can use oats, or in the summer you can use sorghum or Sudan grass. There's legumes, which is basically anything in the pea family. So that actually includes clovers, hairy vetch, Austrian winter pea, soybeans, field peas, cowpeas. Brassicas are a good one. They have a lot of benefits in term. They can reduce disease pressure in your garden through a kind of biological fumigation process. That's basically because they're full of sulfur. But the daikon radish is actually a really cool one too. If you like Korean food or kimchi, then you may have come across a daikon radish before. But some of these things are cool. They can grow 2 to 3 feet long. So they're also referred to as a tillage radish. And so basically this giant radish grows 2 or 3 feet down and just like busts through all the compaction in your soil. And then in the winter, if it gets below like 25 degrees or something, the radish then will die. And that basically, and then it'll start rotting and composting down. And so that basically just becomes this like 2 foot long tube of organic matter that's like rotting down in your garden. And it does really good things for like drainage and soil health. The only downside to these daikon radishes is that when they do die and start decomposing, they kind of smell sulfurous. And so your garden can get a little bit stinky in the winter, but it's for good things. Final category is non-legume broadleaves. This is just the term that the industry uses. It's not a great term, but this includes buckwheat, which is my favorite thing to plant in the summer. If you have a space that you're not going to put anything else in for the summer, you can just put buckwheat down. Also includes things like flax, sunflowers, marigolds, and some other edible crops. So, you know, if you want to give a spot in your garden a rest, that, you know, you can actually plant, you know, a sunflower and like pea mix, and that would be considered a cover crop over the summer. So something to think about. You know, there's a lot of, I'm gonna go through, I don't really feel like going through all this. If you're super curious about cover crops, which I happen to love the topic, you know, you can read through this and do some more research, but I'm basically, I guess, trying to explain, you know, once you're out of this program, if you want to get a cover crop mix, you know, these are some steps you can follow, but most of your mix, you want it to be grasses. In the winter, I really prefer rye. I think rye is a really awesome cover crop mix because the ideal time to plant cover crops for the fall is in September, but rye will germinate into November and December. So if it's really late in the year and you still haven't put your cover crop in, you can still plant rye and it will still germinate. and late cover crop is better than no cover crop. So it's just something to think about. Legumes, you want them to be, you don't want them to dominate the mix, but you do want them in there 10 to 40%. They will fix nitrogen in your soil. So they're a really awesome thing to benefit. Here's a picture of that daikon radish, you know, going 2 feet down in the soil. So you can really see what it's up to, but you don't want these to be too much. So really just no more than 5% of your mix. And then buckwheat, this is the picture of buckwheat. Bees love it. Attracts pollinators. So anyway, here's our recipe basically for our cover crop mix. It's 50% rye, 30% Austrian winter pea, 15% crimson clover, 5% daikon radish. And we will distribute this in mid-September. So you'll have plenty of time to get it in before the end of the month. And if you're a little later than that, it's fine. It's just that the later you go, the less the other parts of the cover crop mix other than the rye the less time they're going to have to grow and mature. So the earlier you can get them in, the better. Then we get into the spring and you have this lush stand of vegetation, and you want to start thinking about, you want to plant your spring and summer crops. So you will need to start collecting tarps or lots of cardboard or some other kind of opaque material. And then you need to get in there at least 3 weeks before you want to plant. So you have time to smother the crops. So you basically just mow it down or weed eat it, or even just go in there and kind of step on it. Although I try to not have folks step on their planting areas, but whatever you need to do to get it flattened, and then you put a tarp over it and weigh it down. 3 weeks, that should be enough time for it to die from lack of sunlight. And then it will leave a nice thick, hopefully residue of dead plant material, and you can leave that there and just plant directly into it. So if you're transplanting plants, like 6 or 8 week old plants, you can just do that directly into the cover crop material. And so basically you've just created your own mulch, without having to do any work for it, without having to haul it in and lay it out like you would straw. So you can plant directly into it. You can also plant large seeds directly into it. So this includes squash, beans, corn, that kind of thing. They're totally, the big seeds have no problem just busting through the cover crop residue and growing. For small seeds, you will actually need to clear out the cover crop residue, or use a really small tiller like a mantis, just to kind of turn over the first inch or two of the soil to create a flat seed bed. So this would be for lettuce, carrots, brassicas, that kind of thing. Things that are tiny seeds, you do need to clear out the cover crop residue, just so that they will germinate. All right, that was a lot of information, but I'm here now to answer more questions, and I can go back over if folks want me to revisit something. Okay, my garden is no-till. Okay, she's talking about lasagna gardens. So that's one of the no-till techniques if you want to look it up. Basically, fall's a great time to start just dumping organic matter on it and putting that work in, so that by spring you have nice soil to work with. Okay, so compost. If the heat is not enough, so you're not putting in like food scraps or diseased plant material into your materials that you're laying on your garden for the winter. Okay, so what I said about compost is if you're going to put in weeds or diseased plant material or food scraps into your compost pile, then you have to actively be turning it and aerating it and making sure that it gets up to temperature in order to kill those seeds, in order to kill the pathogens on those plants, that kind of stuff, and to make sure that you're having an aerobic process to create actual compost. So that's not necessarily applying to the situation, because you're going to be using mostly shredded leaves, straw, old hay, stuff like that. So you're not putting in things that will carry pathogens with them, and so you don't need to turn it. Basically, you're creating it's basically just going to slowly compost on its own, because it's very rich in carbon and very lower in nitrogen than a traditional compost pile is. So that churning and that aerobic process you don't need to worry about that for this kind of composting in place. So this is much easier than trying to manage a compost pile. It's much less work. So yeah, don't put your kitchen scraps. You can use, if you want to purchase compost, or you are actively managing your compost pile properly, then yeah, you can spread that on your garden in the fall. Free of rye. So I don't, so she's worried about celiac disease. You're not letting it go to seed. And so it's just decomposing basically before anything in your garden touches it. You could cover crop with oats, I guess, if you're super worried about it, but I don't think that any part of this plant material is going to get into any food crops. But yeah, you could cover crop with oats over the winter, or with like sorghum in the summer, or buckwheat. None of those would have gluten in them, but you're not letting it go to seed, so you're not getting any kind of gluten development in the plants. Any tips for cover crops if you use landscape fabric? Yeah, you want to pull up the landscape fabric in the fall, just as a means to extend the life. You don't want to leave that out over the winter, just because it's going to degrade faster. So you want to let it dry off. You want to take it off, dry it off, and roll it up and put it in a garage or somewhere dry for the winter. And then, yes, you want to put down cover crops, you know, in that space so that that soil is getting exposed, and having something growing in it. What is the best method for adding nutrients? Yeah, so if you want to put in garden plants in the fall, just add more, like I said, in the spring, just add 2 tablespoons of our Harmony fertilizer into each planting hole, or 2 tablespoons per row foot if you're planting seeds in. So it's basically the same as the spring for fertilizing. And then, oh, your husband wants to move it to the back. No, you can start now with this no-till method. So you could put pile on cardboard and, you know, 6 to 12 inches of material like straw or old hay or shredded leaves, grass clippings, that kind of stuff. If you put in 6 to 12 inches of that material and let it rot down, you're going to be in a good spot in the spring. You may need to till again in the spring if your soil is still super thick, but you may not. That's just something you're gonna have to test out. But yeah, you can start with the no-till now and get set up for spring. So in September, for example, it's planting or preparing soil. Shar, what do you mean by that? Are you on?
Sorry. Yeah, just unmute. So I am asking, like, if you're preparing, we talked about planting, you know, for the winter crops, but if you're planting in September, you're not also preparing the soil, making a lasagna or whatever, right? So is it like sections of the garden or?
Yeah. So I think it's unlikely that you're going to plant out your entire, I mean, you know, it depends on the size of your space, but it's probably unlikely that you're going to fill the entire garden space with fall crops. So whatever part of your garden, and you want to mulch those well too. So you can put in, you know, 4 or 6 inches of mulch around your fall crops. And you know, kind of get the benefits of doing both things in those spots. But then in the spaces where you're not planting anything, then yeah, you want to either put in a really thick layer of mulch or you want to cover crop in those spaces, one or the other.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Yes, if you want to dump a ton of leaves over the garden for the winter, should we plant cover crop? Yeah, if you're going with the thick leaf mulch, you don't necessarily need to worry about cover cropping. I would say that cover cropping is probably slightly more beneficial, but also kind of more of a pain in the butt to deal with than putting on a thick layer of mulch. But I think in the end, as long as you're not leaving bare soil over the winter, you're in a good spot. So yeah, you have to pick one or the other. I think cover cropping is slightly better, but putting a thick layer of mulch is also totally fine in the end. So yeah. Tarp 2. Over the, yep, sorry.
Sorry, yeah, I figured I should elaborate. Well, so everything that you said, should we just put a tarp on top of all that, if, like with the cardboard or whatever else? I'm gonna have to go back and rewatch this, but the leaves and all of that. Sorry.
If you have cardboard and a thick layer of mulch, you do not also need to tarp. Okay.
Okay.
The tarping is more for the killing the cover crops, basically.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, we can just like put a tarp on it, cover it. Because also we have dogs and they kind of run loose and.
Yeah, if you want to protect it from the dogs, then you can. There's nothing bad about tarping your lasagna garden, basically. You just don't need to, but you can if you want to protect it.
Garden meeting. I forgot.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but that's not a big deal.
Okay.
I don't have to talk to them.
Okay. So what about covering with shredded leaves in the fall? Yeah, I think I answered that if unless you have a further question, but yeah, it's fine to cover with a thick layer of shredded leaves. Just make sure they're shredded. You don't want to put unshredded or whole leaves on there because they kind of create an impenetrable, they kind of mash together and will basically just cause rain to slick off of them, and they don't decompose as well. So you need them shredded and light and fluffy, so that they'll start to decompose over the winter. So if you have like a bag on your lawnmower, I like to just collect the shredded leaves and grass clipping mix. That's a really awesome mix of carbon and nitrogen plant material. And so that makes a really awesome fall mulch for your garden. But yeah, you definitely want them shredded. All right, any other questions?
For the raised beds, does this advice change much?
No, this mix will do fine in a raised bed. It may be, and it may be a little easier to terminate the cover crops too, in a raised bed, because they're a smaller space, and so you're not spending so much on large tarps. So it can, but then you have to have a bunch of smaller individual tarps, whereas just putting in a bunch of shredded leaves or whatever, maybe it just depends on what's easier for you. I think
if I did, I have a few places that I pulled out and I'm not going to be able to fall garden. So what I was thinking was to go ahead and pile up my organic material and then put cardboard on top now.
Yeah.
If I leave that and it just breaks down, then I should be good for winter. But then, I mean, is there, I'm sorry, I just completely lost track of what I was saying while I was saying it. So if I do, go ahead.
If you piled up like 12 inches of stuff, it'd probably last through the winter and into spring.
Okay.
Yeah.
That was my very strange way. That was what I was trying to ask.
Yes. If you're just like done and ready to move on with certain parts of your garden, just pile on a thick layer of leaves or straw or whatever. Make it as thick as you can. And it will just rot down and have good benefits. Again, I think cover crops are slightly better, but I think in the end, both are fine.
Okay. Yeah. I'm trying to extend that raised bed area. So I just wanted to go ahead and get all that ready.
Yeah,
thank you.
Absolutely. All right. Any final questions? Good. All right. I'm gonna let y'all go.